Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome to Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò at New York University in the Department of Italian Studies for the presentation of this new translation of Carlo Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio. This is the edition we are presenting tonight. As you will see, it's not only a new translation, but it's a new reading, especially for the American public, that tries to, I think the subtitle is the most translated and misinterpreted novel in Italian literature. So Anna Kraczyna, who is here with us, who is one of the translators of Pinocchio, is going to give us her approach about what it meant for her translating Pinocchio, and especially giving back to Pinocchio its real meaning, what it was intended to be, aside from the, how can we say, the sweetened versions, especially the Disney one, that's the one that comes to mind. I noticed that when I talk about Pinocchio in my class, the reference is not to the book or to the sceneggiati that we used to see in Italy as kids that were rather faithfully based on the book, but on the Pinocchio by Disney. That is a completely different story, and I think Anna is going to talk a little bit also about that. And with Anna Kraczyna, that, as I told you, is the co-author of the new translation, we have a very, very good group of discussants. And we have Larry Wolff and Perri Klass. Larry Wolff is a professor here in the Department of History. The bios, you find them in our website. He's an expert of European history and a wonderful opera impresario. I'm saying that because Larry and Perri had just finished their term as directors of NYU Florence, and we collaborated on a variety of things, including staging new operas. And Larry did that with great passion and great gusto. And Perri Klass is a professor of journalism and pediatrics at NYU. And if the connection seems not one of the normal ones you're used to, Perri also has a regular column in the New York Times, and you can read what she writes about children education and adolescent education. So they're perfect for this context. The last time I met them outside of the beautiful NYU property in Florence, Villa La Pietra, it was, guess where? We were in a cemetery. It was like sort of towards the end of the pandemic, so we could move around with caution. And I met them there. I was with my friend Federica, and we were looking for Carlo Collodi's tomb. And it was Cimitero delle Porte Sante. For those of you who are familiar with Florence, it's up at San Miniato, one of the most beautiful places in Florence. You have a fantastic view of the city. And right next to the abbey, to the monastery, there is the cemetery where several important people are buried. Try to find Carlo Collodi's tomb. For a country like Italy, obsessed with relics, tombs, the remnants, it's basically impossible. It's not marked. We had the fortune of running into a lady, American lady, was restoring another monument, and she happened to know where it was. So there are curtains, the name is not there, but we know that that's actually the burial place. So that is also an interesting part of Collodi, the author of probably one of the most well-known Italian books in the world, is buried in a very important cemetery right in Florence, and not recognized for being buried there. And as you know, everywhere else you go in Italy, being a Catholic country, even non-Catholic have this obsession with the tomb as a sort of a place of burial that, as you know, was the origin of cathedrals and churches since the early Middle Ages on. So that's where we met the last time, and that's where we had our conversation on Collodi. And finally, we have also Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is a professor of history and Italian studies here at New York University. Her last book is Strong Men, and you might have seen her frequently on CNN, MSNBC, because the times in which we live call for Ruth's insight in helping us understand and recognize strong men and authoritarians when they arise, and possibly before. So the reason why we invited Ruth to be here with us to talk about Pinocchio is not a specialty that she cultivates on Pinocchio on top of the many others that she has, but it's because she was a consultant on the last Guillermo del Toro's movie on Pinocchio that, for the express will of Guillermo del Toro, is set not in 19th century Italy, but in fascist Italy. And Ruth was a consultant to recreate this environment for the adventures of Pinocchio. So we have a great, interesting evening. I know there are also many people that are following in streaming. And so without further ado, I would like to ask you to welcome Anna Kraczyna to talk to us about the new translation of The Adventures of Pinocchio.
Thank you, Stefano. I'd like to thank every one of you for being here tonight. I would also like to say thank you to Stefano's staff for organizing everything for me to be here. And also, I would like to thank my home institution, Kappa Education Abroad, for making it possible for me to be here tonight. Last but not least, thank you to each of you for being here. It's a true pleasure. So this is the book that Stefano was talking about. In the next 45 minutes or so, I'll barely brush upon some of the true messages of the Adventures of Pinocchio, the story, as we all know, of a marionette who becomes a little boy. We will discover that this is not a book about lying, which is what so many people believe. The Adventures of Pinocchio is a work of literature that touches on much deeper and pervading themes, themes that appear again and again throughout the book, and I believe ones that have a special relevance to all of us. We will also try to understand how an almost 150-year-old Italian puppet has become an icon of our times. The fact is that The Adventures of Pinocchio is not just kids' stuff. Yes, it was written for children, and indeed it was published in installments in Il Giornale per i Bambini, which is the newspaper for children, between 1881 and 1883 by Carlo Collodi, whose real name was Carlo Lorenzini. So clearly it was intended for children, but not only for them. This is a book that's rich in subtle allusions and artful devices, comparable to Alice in Wonderland that way, or to Gulliver's Travels. It's a story with many layers of meaning. But many people have been conditioned by this. Disney's 1940 cartoon movie is about a cute little chap who tells the odd fib. He's brought to life in some unspecified alpine country where his creator, Geppetto, speaks with an Eastern European accent, not an Italian one. But then it was 1940, remember, and Mussolini's Italy had just gone to war against the United States' European allies. So Italy wasn't exactly popular in Hollywood. To set things straight, the original book, first of all, is not set in the Alps. The action takes place in Tuscany. And Pinocchio is not a sweet, cute little guy. He's actually a real brat. He's certainly good-hearted, which is stated over and over again throughout the book, but he's no angel. This, in fact, is how he was first depicted by Enrico Mazzanti when the book came out. He's not really a child, is he? And he's got attitude. It looks like he's out looking for trouble. The gap between the way that the Pinocchio story is considered by many people in Italy and the view taken of it by speakers of English is immense. In fact, for Italians, and by the way, despite my name and my accent, I am Italian, The Adventures of Pinocchio is a masterpiece. It's considered one of our greatest works of our literary canon, and it's a constant source of inspiration for artists of all kinds. But not only in Italy, in fact. This, for example, is a poster of an exhibition in Florence a few years ago on the paintings, sculptures, and other works of art based on Pinocchio by world-renowned artists such as Giacometti, Calder, La Chapelle, and many more. And around the time of that exhibition, one of Italy's leading movie directors, Matteo Garrone, whose latest film, Io Capitano, has been spoken about in these last few days, released his version of Pinocchio, which is altogether more faithful to the original book. You may have seen it because it's been playing in art houses here in the US. But in 2022, no less than 3 new Pinocchio movies came out. There was a Russian cartoon film dubbed into English. There was a Disney live-action remake of its 1940 cartoon starring Tom Hanks, which was almost universally panned by the critics. And at the end of 2022, Guillermo del Toro, who won 2 Oscars with The Shape of Water, released a stop-motion animated version of Pinocchio. It won fulsome praise from the critics and brought del Toro a 3rd Oscar for Best Animated Feature. We will be speaking about it further on because we are lucky to have Professor Ben-Ghiat here with us this evening. But back to Pinocchio, that's not all. From December 22 to April 23, here in New York City, there was an exhibition at the MoMA on the craft and processes behind the film, and this exhibition later on moved on to the West Coast. Last year, there was a South Korean video game called Lies of P, which was based on the Adventures of Pinocchio, which was released, and it had, and maybe is still having, such success that the New York Times had an article about it. And list goes on. In a few days, on the occasion of Italian Design Day, the Italian Cultural Institute of San Francisco will be hosting a show on Pinocchio and Italian design. We could go on and on. The point is, I think we could all agree that the Pinocchio story has clearly struck a chord with a lot of creative people and with people in general. All of a sudden, Pinocchio is in vogue. Pinocchio is everywhere. Pinocchio has become, as I was saying, a universal icon of our times. But why? To answer that question, we need to, of course, reflect on the original book. Here it is. So, let's jump into the text. The story begins with a very conventional c'era una volta, once upon a time. And although it certainly doesn't seem like it, the use of the formula c'era una volta actually proves the point I was making earlier. By opening his story in this apparently traditional way, Carlo Collodi is sending a message. As paradoxical as it may seem, he's telling us that the story is not, in fact, just for children. But how do we know that? Well, Carlo Collodi was also a very well-known and highly influential satirical journalist, and c'era una volta was a sort of in-joke among the satirists in his circle. It was a phrase he and they had often used to start articles that were apparently fairy tales, but which were actually social or political satires. Collodi himself was quoted in the journal La Lente in 1856, so a long time before Pinocchio, as having said, I quote, "Hey, have you mistaken us for a bunch of kids with that once upon a time? No, hold on, I'm not telling you a fairy tale as would seem to be the case, but instead I'm recounting a historical fact," end of quote. So clearly, with his once upon a time, Collodi is sending a message that this is serious stuff. And against this background, it's actually no surprise that The Adventures is a great work of literature. It's also a story told with a brilliant use of language. Italian scholars have written books and books on its historical and linguistic relevance, as well as on its cultural, social, political, and even religious significance. Intellectuals and writers of the stature of Italo Calvino, Umberto Eco, Carmelo Bene, Federico Fellini, the list goes on, were fervent admirers of the book. Parallelisms have been drawn with milestones of Italian literature like Dante's Divine Comedy and Manzoni's The Betrothed, as well as with others. As all great works of literature, The Adventures of Pinocchio touches on themes that are universal and that are of the essence in every time and place. The book, as we said, on the surface is a children's story, but below the surface it offers many layers of meaning. Just barely beneath the surface, let's say at the first layer, the story reflects many of Italians' enduring national characteristics over and over again. It's actually a satire on numerous of our defining traits that are as true today as they were in Carlo Collodi's time, which makes it a deeply amusing read for anyone interested in Italy and its people, and for us Italians too, of course. In fact, We feel a very strong connection to the book, maybe because it's so revealing of us. And to take a look at a few of these characteristics, let's go back to the beginning of our story, and this time for real. The story opens with a Tuscan carpenter, Mr. Cherry, who's astonished to hear a voice coming from inside a lump of wood. As we know, he gives the lump of wood to his friend Geppetto, who's a wood carver, and Geppetto brings Pinocchio to life. But not before the two men have a big falling out. They attack each other, they bite each other, scratch each other, they rip off each other's wigs. But then Collodi writes, they, and I quote, shook hands and swore they would remain friends to the end of their lives, end of quote. This depicts a very Italian trait, the ability of Italians to forgive and forget even quite serious disagreements. And the same episode brings to light another very Italian characteristic. During the fight, as we saw, the two little old men rip off each other's wigs. Now, if we consider that the story was written in the 1880s and that by that time no one or almost no one was wearing a wig any longer in Italy, it's clear that Collodi is making the two men into figures of fun. Geppetto and Mr. Cherry are putting on airs and graces and pretending to be gentlemen. On one hand, that makes it even more ridiculous, but on the other, it shows the importance of keeping up appearances in all senses of the word, even among the poor. So what Collodi is giving us here is a reference to that most Italian of concepts, bella figura. Making a good impression on others, bella figura, or fear of brutta figura, is constantly present all throughout the book, as it truly is in Italian life. But back to the story, Pinocchio comes to life and immediately he starts misbehaving. He runs away from home, he gets his father sent to jail, he kills a talking cricket. Instead of going to school, he sells his spelling book to go see a puppet show. And shortly after, he ends up on the wrong side of the fearsome puppeteer, Mangiafuoco, fire eater. He risks, Pinocchio does, being killed by this terrifying monster of a human being. But then Mangiafuoco has a change of heart and ends up giving Pinocchio 5 gold coins to take to his father. So Mangiafuoco is actually not the terrible man he pretends to be. And that points to something that everyone comes across in Italy, which is theatricality, people acting out a part. Italy is a country, a society in which theater is really a part of life, and you do well to bear in mind that not everything that is threatened is really meant. But the way in which Pinocchio actually brings about Fire Eater's abrupt change of heart is even more quintessentially Italian. The puppet deploys flattery, but flattery of a very specific kind. He addresses Fire Eater using titles that grow in splendor and importance as he desperately tries to win him over. This is how it goes. "Have pity, Mr. Fire Eater," said Pinocchio. "There are no misters here," repeated the puppeteer sternly replied. "Have pity, Mr. Knight. There are no knights here. Have pity, Mr. Lord. There are no lords here. Have pity, Your Excellency." And finally it works. Again, I quote, "Hearing himself called Excellency, the puppeteer immediately pursed his lips, and having suddenly become more humane and approachable, he said to Pinocchio, 'So then, what do you want from me?'" End of quote. Anyone used to navigating social interactions in Italy will recognize how typical this is, because titles truly are used as a means of flattery in Italy, and they truly are important, plus it's critical to use the right one. Which also points to the high degree of attention paid to formality, which is literally embedded in our language, as anyone who speaks the language knows. And something else this episode brings out, I think, is Italians' essential soft-heartedness. In Italy, rules can be bent. and forgiveness is ubiquitous. So back to the story of Pinocchio. Pinocchio sets off with his gold coins, and before he can take them to Geppetto, he runs into two of the most famous characters in the story, Il gatto e la volpe, the cat and the fox. Two villains who represent that untranslatable concept, furbizia, which is omnipresent in Italian life. If you look in an Italian English dictionary, you will find cunning, sly, deceitful, and those words all cover the meaning to some extent, but in Italian, the concept is not always completely negative. There's a world of difference, for example, between fare il furbo, which is negative and means taking an unfair advantage, like jumping the queue, and essere furbo, which means knowing how to get your way in life, and which almost always attracts at least a tad of admiration. But the cat and the fox's furbizia is anything but admirable. Though Collodi ridicules them, they embody all that is evil about furbizia. And to continue our analysis, at one point, much further ahead in the story, Pinocchio is seized by a farmer and made to work as a watchdog. He's chained up and he laments his plight, but then, in a very Italian way, he resigns himself to his fate. And he uses a phrase you will hear over and over again in Italy, which is ci vuole pazienza. Literally, patience is needed. This sense of fatalism is woven into our DNA. Many have speculated that this is because of our history. From the end of the Roman Empire in 476 to Italy's unification in 1861, so for 14 centuries, Italians were all too often subjugated to the will of foreign rulers. So it's the lack of control over their own destiny that may explain Italians' fatalism. But Italians' lack of control over their own destiny also perhaps helps explain furbizia as an essential tool for survival. Collodi gives us a good example of this. The farmer's previous watchdog, called Melampo, has just died. And Melampo's job was to protect the farmer's chickens from the local weasels, the faine. But Pinocchio actually discovers that Melampo was in cahoots with the weasels, with the faine. Melampo would turn a blind eye every time the weasels broke into the chicken coop. And in return for his acquiescence in their nefarious exploits, they gave him a neatly plucked chicken for every 8 they stole. It's what in English you would call 12.5% kickback, and what in Italy we call a tangente. But, and this is a key point, I can remember from my childhood in the Tuscan countryside how dogs like Melampo were treated by the farmers. They never had enough to eat. They were skin and bones. And they spent their whole lives on a chain, just like poor old Melampo. So perhaps Collodi here is making a point that the origin of much furbizia is tied to deprivation. Collodi was constantly and fervently criticizing social injustice. And in fact, injustice is another one of the main themes that runs through the book, and that includes social injustice. This is a fairy tale with no princes or princesses, a fairy tale in which there are no knights in shining armor and no damsels in distress. Collodi's characters are almost all victims of grinding poverty. Hunger, in fact, is one of the main themes that runs through the story from beginning to end. Pinocchio is always constantly hungry. And what's more, Collodi's characters live their lives at the mercy of a legal system which is unjust and unpredictable. For example, in both the episodes in which the carabinieri feature, they do the wrong thing and arrest the wrong person. They're depicted by Collodi as being both not so smart and unjust. They're actually bad guys. In what fairy tale in any other country are the police bad guys? This speaks volumes about Italians' enduring cynicism about the forces of law and order and about authority in general. But it gets better. The cat and the fox, as we know, end up managing to steal Pinocchio's gold coins. So Pinocchio goes to court to ask for justice. But what happens? The judge, who, by the way, is an ape, sends Pinocchio to jail instead. And why? As a punishment for being gullible. So here's a story written for children in which the message is don't expect justice from institutions. And if you're gullible, you're going to pay for it. It's pretty striking. Pinocchio eventually does get out of jail, but only thanks to an amnesty. Again, Collodi is confronting us with a recurring practice in Italy. Amnesties of various kinds were, but still are, an enduring feature of Italian life. But Pinocchio's problem is that actually he has not broken the law, so the amnesty doesn't apply to him. And it's only after he protests in the politest possible way that he's released. What he says is, "Domando scusa, ma sono malandrino anch'io." In other words, I do beg your pardon, but I too am a crook. And it's only then that he's set free. Collodi's satire couldn't be more bitter. So we were talking about the way hunger pervades the tale from beginning to end. Well, we all know that one way of trying to fight hunger is to talk about food. Dacia Maraini, the Italian writer and intellectual who, as you all know, survived concentration camps in the Second World War, writes and still talks extensively about this, about the way people in the camp would spend hours and hours in the evenings describing food and recipes in minute detail. And that's something that we find in the Adventures. We run into meticulous descriptions of food and dishes all throughout the story. And there's a funny part of the story, in fact, tied to this. When the cat and the fox convince Pinocchio that if he plants his coins in the field of miracles, there will grow a tree that will yield lots more gold coins, instead of taking him to the field or even just robbing him straight away, they take him to an inn, Il Gambero Rosso, the Red Crayfish Inn. That, of course, is why Italy's foremost food and drink magazine is called Il Gambero Rosso. And the same is true of its most famous gastronomic guides. What's more, dozens, scores of restaurants around Italy are called Il Gambero Rosso. As always, in Italy, food is of the essence. So upon leaving the Red Crayfish Inn, Pinocchio at first escapes being robbed, but then he's chased through the woods in the dark by the cat and the fox, who end up hanging him from a tree. And that's the way the story was meant to end. This was the end of the run of installments first published in the children's newspaper. And it was only after an outcry from Collodi's readers that he was persuaded to continue what eventually became the book. So, until here, there is something missing from the original story, because so far there has been no mention at all of Pinocchio's nose growing when he tells a lie. So had the story ended here at the first run of installments, there would be no Pinocchio emoji for a fib, no Pinocchios given out by the fact checkers at the Washington Post, no Pinocchio hand gesture, and maybe no Pinocchio at all. And for sure, we wouldn't all be here. It's only in the second part of the book, so in the 17th chapter, in fact, that finally Pinocchio's nose grows for the first time because of telling a lie. But mind you, his nose has grown for other reasons, and he has told lies without his nose growing. So the point is, clearly, Collodi did not intend the book to be about lying. But if he didn't intend it to be about lying, which is what everyone thinks, What did he intend it to be about? Up till now, we've been talking about what this book tells us about Italy and Italians. But these defining characteristics are not just limited to societal aspects like the ones we have seen, and we've only touched upon some of these, not all of them. The truth is, we're also confronted with themes that certainly, as we have seen, are not to be expected in a children's tale. We have been speaking, in fact, about themes that have to do with social justice, police brutality, the distorted reality of an unjust legal system, bribery, the unfair treatment of the weaker segments of society, furbizia as a response to deprivation and need, grinding poverty, real, constant, unrelenting hunger. These themes regarding social justice that are below the first layer of meaning are universal, and they are of the essence in every time and place. And if we continue going down beneath the surface, we see that the further down we go, the more pervading and relevant to us all the themes become. One of the core themes of Carlo Collodi's masterpiece is the cruciality of resisting obtuse imposition of rules in an authoritarian society, which is very much what Guillermo del Toro made his film about. Then we have also the theme of relationships between parents and children. Remember, Del Toro's film is all about father and son relationship. The Adventures of Pinocchio is also a story about parents expecting their children to follow a path that was predetermined by the parents themselves, and about the importance that children follow their own path in order to grow up. Geppetto, in fact, has declaredly made Pinocchio so that the two of them could tour the world together, putting on fencing and backflip performances to earn a crust of bread. And Geppetto had wanted Pinocchio to go to school, but instead Pinocchio runs away and does his own thing. He lives his adventures, in fact. The puppet is constantly in and out of trouble. He's constantly falling down, but then picking himself up again, which brings us to another central message, that of knowing you will fail in life, and of the importance of, once you've fallen, of picking yourself up after having fallen. Falling is okay because and as long as you can pick yourself up again. Collodi seems to be telling us that making mistakes is part of the path to becoming truly human. In fact, the story stresses the cruciality of learning from your own mistakes. Carlo Collodi was an advocate of learning from direct experience. Furthermore, this is a book about not wasting your life, as we will see in a moment. But then we get to the importance of education. The whole plot revolves around Pinocchio either going to school or not going to school, which is when he gets into all sorts of trouble. And the biggest trouble is waiting for him near the end of the book. Pinocchio's friend Lucignolo, Lampwick, persuades him to quit school and go with him to a wonderful place where children don't have to study. On the contrary, they spend all day, every day, playing to their heart's content. This is Il Paese dei Balocchi, Playland. What happens to Pinocchio and Lampwick and in Playland sends a clear message against wasting your life. In fact, Playland is a dangerous place. After 5 months, one fine morning, Pinocchio and Lampwick wake up with donkey ears. Gradually, they turn into real donkeys and they begin to bray. They become unable to talk, which in itself is significant. Just think about it. If you're a donkey, you can't communicate with anyone except other donkeys. It's this transformation, not the one of the nose growing, that's the key point of the Adventures of Pinocchio. In Italian, the word for donkey is applied both to those who are worked to the point of exhaustion or indeed death, the phrase is lavorare come un ciuco, and to those who don't do well at school. What we say is essere un ciuco or essere un asino, though not necessarily because they are stupid, but because they refuse to study. Collodi's point from the very beginning of the book, from chapter 4, is that being a donkey at school leads to being exploited or deceived and working like a donkey afterwards. It's in chapter 4 that we see that Pinocchio tells the talking cricket that he, Pinocchio, doesn't feel a bit like studying because he gets lots more fun out of chasing butterflies. And the talking cricket replies, and I quote, "Don't you know that by acting that way, you're bound to grow up to be an absolute donkey and everyone will make a fool of you?" End of quote. In fact, after they have turned into donkeys, Pinocchio and Lampwick are sold off at a local market. Pinocchio literally works as a donkey. First, he's made to work in a circus, where he goes through a series of heartbreaking misadventures. Then he narrowly escapes being killed for his hide. And then he works turning the water wheel all day long, which is typically what was done by donkeys in Collodi's time. Lampwick, though, is worked to death. The fate that, in a less dramatic form, awaited many unskilled laborers in Collodi's day. It's a well-known concept that the less educated people are, the easier it is for others, including and especially politicians, to deceive and control them. It's no coincidence that Guillermo del Toro's movie is set in Italy in the days of its fascist dictatorship. And this is something that Carlo Collodi in his various journalistic articles fought passionately for. The right to education for both boys and girls. The only way to avoid living the life and maybe dying the death of a donkey is to get an education, and that's what Pinocchio finally does. But, and this is a key point, it's not in school that Pinocchio completes his education. He only understands the importance of education when he's literally working like a donkey all day long. So what he does is he spends every evening after he's worked all day learning to read on an old used and half-torn book and learning to write with the twig dipped in berry juice. Let's remember that Collodi himself had quit school at one point, and that his formal education only went as far as the end of high school. He was, as Pinocchio, much self-taught. There are many indicators that Pinocchio is actually Carlo Collodi's alter ego. So let's not forget, Collodi is not referring only to formal education. This is not an elitist message. So the question we had initially asked ourselves, why is Pinocchio suddenly in vogue, can certainly be answered by the fact that the book's messages are still universally compelling. But I believe there are further reasons. Analyzing the adventures of Pinocchio from our 21st century perspective, we can't ignore themes that are deeply captivating for our times and that may explain why after almost 150 years, Pinocchio is still a worldwide inspiration to filmmakers and artists and people of all kinds, and he has become a universal icon of our times. First of all, again and again, and not only in Italy, politicians have gotten themselves elected by promising a trip to Playland, by telling voters that they can get away without painful sacrifices. Playland delivers a warning against a mindset and outlook that Collodi deplored in many of his journalistic commentaries. And this warning is particularly relevant to our populist time. Furthermore, as much as it may be an interpretation of the adventure's true message, Pinocchio has universally become a symbol of lying. So it's no surprise that Pinocchio has gained such fundamental relevance in this age of fake news and alternative facts in which issues of truth and lies have become all important. And that's certainly also because the story has echoes of AI, artificial intelligence. Pinocchio, above all, is a kind of robot, but with a very independent intelligence, of the kind that AI has developed today. We have seen the same theme of a human-made creation developing an intelligence of its own and getting it out of its creator's control in Mary Shelley Frankenstein, as we have seen it in Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, and in many more examples. And then let's remember we have AI, the film Kubrick began planning and then Spielberg made. But The Adventures of Pinocchio tells the story of the evolution from puppet into a true human being, which brings us to the all-important question. What is it, at last, that makes Pinocchio human? What does it take to be truly human? And as my co-author and I have held in an article for the New York Times and in the notes to our translation, yes, education is fundamental to the adventure's fairy tale ending, in which Pinocchio ceases to be a puppet and becomes at last a real boy. But, in fact, Pinocchio's miraculous transformation requires a further crucial element. It's only when Pinocchio starts to take responsibility for himself and for those he loves that he earns the right to become a human being. The moral of the story, as we have seen, is not that children should always tell the truth. The moral of the story lies in the importance of education. Education is what it takes to be truly human, which is the same question we're investigating when considering AI. Education represents a humanizing and empowering process because it's through education that one develops self-awareness, emotional intelligence, the ability to learn from one's own mistakes, sense of duty towards others, empathy, courage, grit, all those soft skills that define us as human beings and that set us apart from AI. So, I would argue that the true message of the adventures is that until you open yourself to knowledge and to your fellow human beings, you will remain a puppet forever. Politicians will deceive and control you. Other people will exploit you. They will continue to pull your strings. And what, in these increasingly authoritarian times, ladies and gentlemen, could be more ardently relevant than that? Thank you for your attention.
Just give us a couple of minutes. We're going to set up the chairs on the stage. I want to thank Anna for this fantastic introduction to the new translation, but also she retold us the story. I needed to hear it again with the different passages and the value that each of these passages has. So I think it was a great experience for all of us, being told Pinocchio stories live with such passion and such insights and understanding. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you.
And now we're going to be, I think you should sit in the middle.
Thank you.
So we start with Larry and Perri. In Florence, you dedicated quite a bit of energy to children literature and to bringing the theme that is not even discussed much in Italy itself at the center of the research projects that you stimulated and curated at La Pietra. Of course, Pinocchio plays a central role. Is this really children literature? Anna addressed it from the very beginning. And in what sense? And what does Pinocchio tell us about what childhood was in Italy in the 19th century, if anything different from what we experience now?
You want to jump on that, or shall I? So I would say for sure it's children's literature, but just as Anna suggests, children's literature often has a lot in it for adults. There would be no doubt about that. Perri and I actually assign Anna and John's brilliant new translation to our students. As soon as it was available, we assigned it to our students in Florence, and we assigned it to our students in New York this year. And of course our students are not necessarily children, right? They are young adults, and they find something to respond to in Pinocchio. So if I would put it in the context of a great age of children's literature, the late 19th century, one of the things that's most interesting about Pinocchio in this context is that as a puppet, he's kind of morally neutral. We see him corrupted, but we believe in the possibility of his eventual redemption. But he is not like a well-defined bad boy like his contemporary Tom Sawyer, who American children have been responding to since the late 19th century, or a well-defined good girl like Heidi, say, who would be another one of his contemporaries. You don't think Heidi's such a good girl?
Runs away, gets in trouble, takes off her clothes, and runs around.
Okay, maybe not such a good. Maybe we could come up with a better example for a good girl. But I would have said Heidi's
but
good.
not
goodness.
Alice.
Alice is tricky.
Alice is very tricky.
Alice is very tricky.
Children don't necessarily want to read about good boys and good girls.
So that would be one, if just to touch on the second part of your question, the relationship of Pinocchio to the world of late 19th century Italy. And Perri and I have discussed this with Anna many times, right? He belongs to the new Italian Risorgimento state, and his education, which is supposed to make him into a real human, is also supposed to make him into a real Italian of the new Risorgimento state. And it's a world from the middle of the 19th century to the late 19th century, which is introducing mandatory education, primary education all over Europe and all over the United States, really for the first time. And in terms of the reality of what we experience with Pinocchio, we experience the reality of the tension between trying to get poor kids into a schoolroom when they don't actually understand the reason why they should be in their schoolroom, and often their parents don't understand the reason why they should be in a schoolroom either. I mean, famously, the most important tension is the village children are supposed to be working on the farm, and the whole family loses if they're required to be in a classroom during the day. You probably can add to that.
We think that Geppetto can't read and write, right? He's selling his coat to buy a school book for Pinocchio so that Pinocchio can go to school and learn to do the thing that his father cannot do, right? That's a transition you make in a society when education becomes universal. I'll think about trying to come up with, but I agree with you.
Heidi.
No. But she's constant. Think about Fräulein Rottenmeier. She's constantly in trouble.
But she's in trouble because she's so good.
That's true, in a certain sense.
It's the world that's bad. It's Fräulein Rotten. Okay.
Never mind. But I mean, it is true that when we think about, is this children's literature, what is there in a children's book that's also there as a signal for the adults, for the parents? It's interesting, and it's one of the things that's very sophisticated about Pinocchio as a work of children's literature is that as you grow up with it, you understand it differently. You start to get the jokes that maybe your parent was enjoying the first time around while you were just following the story. And I think that's true in a lot of great works of children's literature, that you go back to them that the story is there from the time you're very young and you love it, but that as you come back to it, as you grow up, as you become a teenager or an adult, you suddenly realize that there's more to it. The other thing I'd say, thinking about childhood, speaking, if you will, as a pediatrician, Pinocchio is growing up in a hard world for children. He's growing up in a world where we know from Collodi's family, children die all the time. In fact, I thought a lot about when we talked a lot about the question of whether the puppet is to some extent. How many siblings did Collodi lose? How many sisters?
Only 4 of them survived, so it was 6.
6 of the children in his family didn't live to grow up, and growing up in Florence in the 19th century, it's a world in which lots of children don't make it. Is Pinocchio a little bit the fantasy of the unkillable child? You hang him from a tree, you throw him into the ocean, you try to. I mean, he lives in a hard world. He's almost cooked and eaten. He's almost drowned, but
Everyone wants to put him to work.
That's true as well. But he's a child. He's remarkably resilient. He's kind of unkill. Even the time that Collodi meant to kill him, hanging him from the tree, when the audience wanted him back, you can resuscitate him. He's growing up in a very hard world where the possibility of children, as you say, being worked, being exploited, being taken advantage of, going hungry. The book is, you talked about the food in the book. It's a book in which everybody is always hungry. Pinocchio may be resistant to many of the things which might hurt a flesh and blood child, but boy, he can feel hunger, and he's hungry all the time.
And before I move to Ruth and ask her about the fascist environment that Guillermo del Toro decided to adopt for his film and for which you helped, a more general question, the idea of redemption, of redeeming. He goes from being a puppet to a boy, but it's very secular redemption. It's not intended in the Christian way, and it reflects, of course, the ideas and the ideology of Collodi that was very secular, like most of the people that supported the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy. They were anti-Catholic in the sense they saw the papacy as a sort of an obstacle to reaching that goal. So it's a very secular form of redemption, and I wanted to ask you about that. And on the other hand, I remember that in recent years, Cardinal Biffi, the Archbishop of Bologna, that for many years was considered a papabile, a possible successor to John Paul II. Fortunately, that didn't happen. He was ultra-conservative. But he gave a whole Lenten season of homilies on Pinocchio. And all of a sudden, Pinocchio, written by an anti-clerical author, finds himself as the subject of preaching for an entire Lenten season as an embodiment of Christian values. So I was wondering what we make of that. Is that the destiny of a character like Pinocchio that can be invested with a series of symbolisms and of values that are not necessarily his, or there is something more behind that, the very idea of secular redemption? For Anne and for all of you.
By the way, that's your good girl. The good girl of 19th century children's literature is Elsie Dinsmore, who the books have mostly not survived, who is so religious that even when her cruel father commands her to play the piano on Sunday, she refuses and allows herself to be punished because she will not profane the Lord's Day. Mysteriously, the books have not survived.
It's a great question. What I think is remarkable is that also Mussolini tried to use Pinocchio to magnificare, to make Italians seem great. And it's no wonder that people try to use Pinocchio to prove their points, because Pinocchio is the most translated book in the world. It is the most well-known character in maybe the world, I would want to say. So yes, sure, many people try to use Pinocchio and have tried to use Pinocchio for their own purpose. I like to say that Pinocchio and the cross are the two most famous pieces of wood in our Western culture. Collodi was playing with the fact that Geppetto actually is a diminutive of Giuseppe. And he is a carpenter. So there's a lot to think about there. But then the transformations that Pinocchio goes through all throughout the book. Yes, there's this myth of transformation. Professor Calabresi from Columbia, Bianca Calabresi, is actually doing research on this at this moment because it's such an interesting subject. Yes. Now.
Yes, Larry.
I would just add to that. First, that we would usually, when we would be thinking about 19th century village life, we would think about the church and the schoolhouse as rival perspectives. And Pinocchio is so dominated by the pole of the schoolhouse, where he never arrives, but it's at fundamental for driving the drama of the story, that there almost isn't room for the other perspective. But Pinocchio does, and this is one of the weird things about it, I think, does have a mysterious supernatural female protectress who plays
White
a
and
little bit the role of the protective Madonna, hovering over his fate and future. So, I mean, I don't mean to suggest that it's a religious work. I meant to suggest that it's in some ways, a little bit of a sacrilegious work, in the sense that Collodi creates his own religious mythology, if you'd be willing to accept that.
Yeah.
Within the fable.
Yeah, great. And now I think, Ruth, what happens to Pinocchio during fascism? And why did Guillermo del Toro decide to give that setting to his new film?
Thank you. I think, well, definitely Del Toro, who's a very political filmmaker, got his revenge on Mussolini for trying to use Pinocchio to glorify, Italian culture in the way that the fascism was understanding it. Because Mussolini makes an appearance in Del Toro's film, and he's extremely crude. He's extremely vain, and it's a real satire against Mussolini. But what's really striking is the theme of education, because in Del Toro's version, it's the whole film becomes about the education you get from your father. So there's okay. The education, like parental education. So we have all these bad authority figures. We have this guy Conte Volpe, who is the Mangiafuoco equivalent, who exploits and enslaves Pinocchio for his circus, right? And it's very important that Pinocchio was going to school with his father's, in Del Toro's film, going to school with his father's history text. So this is like a legacy of classical education, and it's there that he gets waylaid in the film and taken off and enchanted. You're going to play all day, but then he's enslaved. The other thing is there's all these negative authority figures, including the priest. And what I was there for, yes, and I was there from the very beginning, because when you consult on films, you can be brought in at many different points of the production. But I was there from the very, very beginning with storyboards and shaping the characters. And so one of the great things, and again, to keep with this theme of education and family and values, is while Mussolini comes in this satirical scene, fascism is experienced and authority is experienced, including by Pinocchio, at the local level with this figure called a podestà, who's like a mayor. And he styled him as a gangster, and I kind of upped his gangster look for the film. But the gangster podestà has a son, too. And this becomes a sub-theme about friendship. And the gangster podestà is teaching the son to be brutal and cruel, but the son's actually pretty nice, and so Pinocchio humanizes him. So there's sentimental education, there's personal growth, and then there's the problem of fascism teaching people to be killers, and that indeed there's a whole scene where they go off, and it's during World War II, and they're being trained to fight, even though they're just boys, and they're being trained to compete. So that's what he did. But he kept the theme of the nose growing and the lying, and Pinocchio becomes this kind of truth teller, where under fascism, particularly, if you tell the truth, if you're too blunt, it's dangerous. And so the Podestà calls him a dissident, a rebel, and wants him to go to school so he can be socialized, i.e. fascicized. So it's very interesting. I had a question for Anna. What when you started working on this, because since you grew up in Italy, you read it, what surprised you the most? Like, was it that the theme of lying was less, because you must have also absorbed the various Pinocchios, not just the original text? I don't know how and when your encounters were with Pinocchio before you became an expert as a scholar.
Thank you. Reading Pinocchio out loud to my son made me realize the amazing language that is used. It's comparable to Dante, in my opinion. It's a language that is fantastic. It's and you can't convey the same beauty of language in the translation. Also, because if you did, Dante, you can translate with structures that don't sound common, but if you translate Pinocchio with a structure that doesn't sound correct, you'll sound like a terrible translator. So first of all, the beauty of the language struck me. But now the fact that it was not a book about lying, I knew, but all the other themes that come out are just, they're amazing. I only touched upon just a very few, but they're so visceral, many of them. Friendship, as you were talking about, father-son relationship. The mother, who is not there but is a blue-haired fairy, what's amazing is that she is the only character in the story that has agency. And this reflects Collodi's consideration of women and the importance for women to get an education, because his mother was a school teacher, and so was his, she didn't work as a school teacher, but she had studied to be a school teacher, and his aunt was a school teacher as well. So going back to your question, it's just such a complex novel, and yeah, you can read it as children's literature, but as you were saying earlier, Perri, every time you read it, it has more meaning and more relevance, and that's true with every book, but this one very, very, very much so. Did you want to add something?
I was going to ask you a question. So, in this world full of dangers in which Pinocchio is living, there's, I don't know, wild beasts and disease, all kinds of things. As you said, the most persistent danger is that people will take advantage of you and trick you. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that is that's the worry? If you don't go to school, if you're not educated, people will take advantage of you.
Obviously, I believe it still is true, but obviously that's what Collodi was seeing, or Carlo Lorenzini was seeing in his world, and he gives us so many descriptions. L'omino di burro, the man who carries Pinocchio and Lampwick away to Playland, and then actually has a scheme of selling these children. That's really scary. There's a part very early on in the book in which Pinocchio is taken advantage of when he's selling a spelling book because he doesn't know how to read. So the dangers for a child in that world were vast, obviously, as they are in this world as well. But I find that the point Collodi is making comes out in chapter 4, and that's if you don't get an education, if you don't do something with your life, people are going to take advantage of you, and that's what happens. Now, there's a very interesting thing that Daniela Marcheschi, who's the main authority for Pinocchio in Italy, points out, and that's that Pinocchio's lies are white lies. In Italian, we have two words, bugie, or bugia, which is pretty much a white lie, and menzogna. And it's the adult characters in The Adventures of Pinocchio who tell menzogne. And the menzogne are told in order to take advantage of others and of Pinocchio. So it's a scary world. It's a very scary world. There's tons and tons of examples of how scary that world is throughout the book.
So I found interesting what Ruth was saying, talking about education as the antidote to being gullible and to being tricked into doing something that you would not want to do. And it's that education in school during fascism were ways in which students were indoctrinated actually into and were made part of the system. Actually, Mussolini, though, had the first reform that really made mandatory education up to the 5th grade really mandatory. There were laws before, Legge Casati, Legge Coppino, but they were ineffective because they left to the city halls the possibility of the obligation of opening schools. But if a small town, a small city didn't have the funding, they didn't open it, and they didn't therefore made mandatory education. So he had the merit of bringing education really mandatory to the 5th grade, but at the same time, he made school into one of the most powerful pieces of his propaganda machine. So how do we distinguish good education and bad education? Or you send Pinocchio to the fascist school, he becomes a fascist.
Yeah, I think that's a fundamental question, because Collodi does not, in fact, send Pinocchio to school straight away. Pinocchio has to live his adventures. He has to say no to his father. He has to not do what the talking cricket, the grillo parlante, tells him to do, not do what his father tells him to do, not do what the blue-haired fairy tells him to do. He has to learn from his own experience. And Collodi wrote articles and was an advocate of this point of view. You've got to learn from your own experience in order to make education something that really does transform your life. And Collodi had written an article regarding the Legge Coppino for mandatory education. He had written an article that it was an open letter. This article has been nicknamed Pane Libri. And he writes an article saying that children especially, cannot study if they haven't had anything to eat. They need to have bread in their tummies before they can actually concentrate on learning. And because of that, the Minister of Education told him that if he didn't stop writing this kind of article, he would lose his job as a civil servant where he was working. So that's one of the reasons why he, for a while, not very long, but until that minister was in place, he didn't really write political articles anymore.
Larry.
I would just say that while, of course, education under Mussolini would have been fiercely indoctrinating, education is usually indoctrinating to some degree. It's one of the things that education does. And Pinocchio is an interesting subject for this because of his moral neutrality, the fact that he's made of wood. He is really the proper blank slate, as Locke envisioned that figure in the late 17th century, and susceptible to whatever kind of indoctrination a school would provide. The other interesting question about education is whether the reason Pinocchio has so much trouble getting to school is because perhaps he's not well adapted for traditional education as it was understood in the 19th century. Perri and I do an assignment for our students in which we let them try to choose a school for Pinocchio, thus bringing Pinocchio together with Maria Montessori, whose schools he could have attended just a very little bit later in Italian history. Because Pinocchio, just as Anna says, is someone who learns from experience, and that would become central to the Montessori method.
There's a famous, if not notorious, article about your friend Tom Sawyer, in which it's speculated that both Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, those two icons of 19th century American mischievous boyhood, would be diagnosed nowadays with attention deficit, with oppositional defiant disorder, would certainly be medicated, constantly getting into fights. There's actually a great passage in Tom Sawyer in which he sits in school and time passes so slowly, right? And outside the window, he can see everything interesting. Well, and, you know, there's been a lot of debate about whether this represents the pathologization of normal boyhood or whether this was actually an accurate portrait of a certain kind of child who is not going to survive if the expectation is education. But Pinocchio is totally distractible. You send him off to school, he hears music playing. You know, he had good intentions. He was going to go to school, but the music is playing, right? So it's an interesting question. What are his strengths? What are his weaknesses? And like many children, his weaknesses can also be his strengths.
Yeah, and by setting this in fascist Italy, Del Toro, you know, points up the problem of being an individual, because fascism was about killing off individuality and killing off spontaneity, as well as kindness and solidarity and the things that you learn in school with other kids, like that's the friendship theme. But the one of the favorite words of fascism was, you know, to inquadrare, to kind of square off, literally, or to get into line, to have fall into line. And so Pinocchio is very dangerous because he's impulsive, and so the interactions of the podestà, the, you know, reigning fascist, but also the priest who's like doing the priest is there, and he's doing fascist salutes, and there's a scene after Pinocchio acts out, and the priest comes with the podestà, because these were the two powers that wanted to squish any kind of creative spark, and squish independent thinking and squish critical thinking. And so by setting it in fascist Italy, he really plays up all of those themes about childhood and education.
I think we can open up the conversation to all of you who are here. If you would please raise your hand, we have a microphone for you. Even if you project and have a very loud voice, we're doing for the people following in live streaming and for the people that will see the recording. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. This is very fascinating. I've been involved in puppetry for a while, looking at it from a number of different perspectives, but a couple of reference points that I wanted to make. The reason education, we have summer educations, vacations during the summer, is because of farming. Because the only way they could get education was if they let the kids off to plant and to go to harvest. The other thing is that little Amal, from the story, the hand-string puppet founder, Basil Jones, said that when, during apartheid, they closed down all the live theaters except for puppets, because nobody took puppets seriously. And this may be about where, and so my question is, we adults have a certain perspective on Pinocchio. What do children actually, what is their response? You were reading to your son. What was his response?
That's a great question. Yes, it's true. Puppets are never taken seriously. My mom was a puppeteer. Children love to read, as Perri and Larry were saying, about mischievous children. I mean, nowadays, let's look at Maurice Sendak's Max, Pierre, and so on. So children love to read Pinocchio. They don't get all of it, of course, because this happens with most children's literature. Collodi was a fine, we could say, psychologist of children's reactions. There's some really scary and some really dramatic moments in the novel. I mean, even I can't avoid crying, and when I was translating, I mean, they're terrible. So children cry, they get scared, but Collodi always manages to then say something light, bring everything back to a children's level. He's incredibly able at doing this, and you know, when you translate, you will spend even a couple of days on one word sometimes because you really want to get it right, and because it's so important under all of its nuances and the way it fits in with all the other words, etc. So this aspect of Collodi's comes across if you're really paying attention to words. Children love it because it's about a naughty boy. And he's a real brat. He really is. He's not mean, but he's a brat. Yeah. I hope I answered your question, and I'm sure other people may want to add something. Ruth, Perri, Larry?
We have questions here.
Okay.
Thank you. First of all, Stefano, you know, we've been here many nights and listened to many lectures. You've set a new bar as far as I'm concerned, and this is really a magnificent presentation. So thank you very much for that. If the point was to get us to read Pinocchio, job well done.
Thank you.
I will throw out one other thing, which is perhaps the good girl is the Little Women. They're pretty popular, but they're pretty good. But
Well, it depends on which.
okay. My question, though, is because I grew up with the Disney Pinocchio, and one of the key elements is the whale episode. Is that in the book? You didn't mention it, and I specifically asked about that because you mentioned some sort of religious connections of the cross and the carpenter, and that's certainly a very, in my mind at least, a religious connotation to Pinocchio. So what was the connection there? But thank you again it's a magnificent evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for your great question. Yes, I didn't touch on the whale. Now, Carlo Collodi was deeply informed intellectual. And he even wrote about animals for children, for them to learn about animals. He wrote many textbooks for children that, by the way, parenthesis, were banned by this Minister of Education because children shouldn't have so much fun when they're learning. I'll close a parenthesis. Yeah, it's written in any case. So Carlo Collodi knew that had to be a whale. He knew that it had to be a whale because of the whole literary tradition of people being swallowed by whales. He chose to call that animal un pesce cane, so a shark. Now, in Florentine, the word for pesce cane is also used for a loan shark. And Carlo Collodi's father had been in big trouble with a loan shark. And Carlo Collodi had rescued his father and had taken the debt and repaid the debt. So we could say that he went and got his father back in the way the pesce cane is the shark's belly. There's an amazing speculation that cannot be confirmed or not, but the City Hall of Florence has confirmed it, but some people do not agree. Speculation regards the fact that Carlo Collodi had used many models for his characters in his book. And it seems that the model for the character of the pesce cane was actually a person who existed whose name was Giuseppe Pagliano, who actually built the Teatro Verdi in Florence. And when, the story is funny, but I'm not going to bore you guys. Okay, so the story is that Pagliano had made a lot of money by loaning money, but also by making this sciroppo. What would you call sciroppo in English? Syrup, yes. So he thought of himself as an opera singer. Now, Collodi was a very important music critic. He wrote on l'Italia Musicale, and he was a very esteemed music critic. He knew a lot about music. He was also an art critic. He was the first critic who gave a positive critique of I Macchiaioli. So there are many tangents, sorry. Giuseppe Pagliano thought of himself as an opera singer, but nobody wanted him in their theater. So what did he do? He built this opera house. But when Collodi describes the pesce cane, he says he's as tall as a building of, I think it's 4 stories. Now, this theater that has been that Pagliano had built is the same number of stories. So there has been great speculation on the fact that probably the pesce cane was Pagliano. Yeah. I hope I've answered your question.
More than I could possibly.
Larry, this is a question that seems to be asked to you. Is there an opera on Pinocchio? And if not, why not?
Not as far as I know. I don't. I mean, the Disney film is, of course, a musical.
Yes.
And has famous musical numbers. But there must be an opera of Pinocchio. But I don't know it. I've never seen it or never heard of it.
If there were an opera about Pinocchio, you would know about it.
Maybe not.
Yeah. No, because
maybe
I never
not.
heard of it either.
Yeah.
Has anybody heard an opera based on Pinocchio? You?
I saw an opera in Lucca, a new opera based on Pinocchio.
There you go.
I don't remember the details, but I saw it maybe 2 or 3 years ago in Lucca. Yeah.
Isn't our audience wonderful? I mean, you have a question, you throw it in, and somebody has an answer. Thank you.
Rosa was part of the set.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much for talking about children's literature. It's a tremendous means for children to gain information and learn about the world. And when it's done right, it's great for adults too, right? So, and I also want to thank you for bringing up banned books, because that was my question. I ran a children's library in a public school for 30 years and taught social studies. And so my question was, if you could insert the story of Pinocchio as it was in the 1800s into the United States, in the context, political and social context of the United States, would Pinocchio be banned? What do you think? What it was talking, in other words, the mission or whatever, the themes that were brought up, if you could take that and then put it into our context now in the book banning that's going on, do you think it would or not?
In my very personal opinion, yes, because children are attracted by naughty children, because we adults are constantly trying to inquadrare children, to make children enter. You tell me if you think I'm saying something that is incorrect, but I think so, because children need to hear that a hero of a children's story is naughty. That means that they have the right to be naughty, and then they can do good things too, as the hero does. So in my very personal opinion, yes. Perri?
May I just say one thing, though? So you mentioned Maurice Sendak, Where the Wild Things Are. That's a banned book.
Right.
That's banned in many
Wow.
states, yeah.
That's
He's
amazing.
a naughty boy.
Yeah.
We were actually just talking about this in the class that I teach at NYU. You have many different currents crossing. You can easily imagine Pinocchio being banned because the police are bad and the judge is incompetent and the institution. So you can imagine on the one hand, but I have to tell you that if you were looking at this as a work of children's literature now, there are many people who would worry that the death, the danger, I mean, I'm constantly amazed by the very well-meaning people who feel it would be too. I left out the part where the child dies when I read this to my daughter, and so again, the idea that what children find in children's literature is often not what we expect them to find. It's not necessarily predictable. I mean, the great thing about literacy as a human right is that, you can read things and decide what you think of them. And so this is, like many great works of children's literature, there's a lot of complexity here. You can cheer him on when he's bad. You can cry when he learns to love his father. Or you can go in another direction, don't you think?
Yeah.
Would add to that, I may be the only person here who thinks that the Disney film is also a sublime masterpiece of animation, but I do think that. It's also terrifyingly scary.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't like what the film Disney has done to Pinocchio of Carlo Collodi, but I have to say, I counted the times in which Pinocchio's nose grows in the Disney film. It's twice, like in the book. So, Disney, why should every artist takes inspiration from other artwork and is free to do what they want? I'm not a fan of Disney's films, but we say Disneyfication for a reason. So, but it is also technically a masterpiece. So yeah, I can't disagree, Larry. I don't like what it's done to Pinocchio, though. Yeah.
I think we have to judge the film by Disney by itself as an animated movie, and it was revolutionary for the techniques. It was the first time that you had these smooth motions and
going into the scene, and I mean, it was technically revolutionary.
And it's great when I teach filmmaking by the book, so techniques of film adaptation, because for the students get wild on finding the differences and explain why a choice was made. So it also brings up a lot of issues that can be discussed with great advantage. We have 2 more questions.
Well, it's not so much a question. It's you keep repeating this idea of children like to read about naughty children. That's a paradox, because that's an adult assignment on children. The tendency is children to be carefree. It's only when the world imposes restrictions on it that we give this idea of them being naughty or not. It's not the children that think they're being naughty; they're just being themselves. It's us imposing this concept on them.
Yes, but it's sorry. Yes, but it's also true that Tom Sawyer has become is the book that we all know. It's Maurice Sendak's character. So yes, I agree. It's us saying that they're being naughty. They're being children. I agree.
And
I don't think I agree. I think that there's a long-standing tension in children's literature in which books are written by adults for children with moral lessons, and children listen to them but enjoy the transgressions rather than learning the moral lessons, or at least that there's been a push-pull back and forth for a long time in which I think that many children enjoy the prospect of, if you've ever seen No David, the naked child running down the street with the adults following him helplessly. But, I think that all of these things are at play.
I guess, I'm more of the belief that children are a blank slate, right?
No.
And in fact, it's something I'm working with on a film that I'm making. And the very first scene is of a toddler taking a pee, right? You don't realize it at first because the camera's tight and it's a full and he's ecstatic about it. And then there's over the shoulder cut to the play on Narcissus, the child delightedly looking at his expression, delighted expression, in the puddle of pee. Until, and he's still delighted, doesn't think he's done anything wrong, even though he's seeing his reflection in this corrupt world, if you will. And then the mother reacts, and his expression changes from one of delight to one of anger, whatever.
We had one more question.
Yes,
though,
thank you. Jana?
I'm looking at this purely as eras and timelines kind of overlapping. The first book is set in Tuscany, in Florence.
Mm-hmm.
And my question has to do with whether or not the original book was ever translated by a publisher in Great Britain prior to Disney taking the rights in 1940.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. It was published only 9 years after it came out, so in 1892. And it was then republished. So it was published in London, and then also in New York, and then it was republished. I mean, it was a big hit. It was a really big hit long before Disney. And actually, I was speaking to some quite elderly people a couple of months, about 6 months ago, and they were telling me that they had their parents' books, and they really hadn't been affected by the Disneyfication because they had seen the parents' books. So yes, before it was a big hit, also before Disney. Then after Disney made it. Disney, yes, there was a silent film in 1911. Disney really made it, turned it into a super hit. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
One more. There are two things that really jump out. One is the person that's lynched. He may have been freed of it, but it still suggests a colonial period, that lynching may have been a way people were killed.
A person that's lynched in
There's a
Pinocchio?
lynching, there's a hanging in the book.
It's Pinocchio that's
right,
hanged,
I understand,
yes.
but he doesn't die. But the issue being, it was attempted. That's one thing that pops out mentally. That's a hard image to present to a school-age child, particularly in the kind of society that we live in, which hopefully looks at those kinds of things with the idea of teaching history correctly, but also mindful of what background information students are bringing to the moment.
That's not the only terrible thing that happens in the book. There are tons of terrible things that happen in the book, and they're a reflection of real life. So.
And Perri, you said that you would skip a part of the...
Oh, I wouldn't. I was responding to the question of what we try to, quote unquote, protect children from. And there's both the impulse to protect them. Again, I'm putting the word protect in quotes, but the worry that children will be exposed to books in which, for example, the police make mistakes. That's one thing, but there's also very often people worry that the death of a sympathetic character, the danger that the child is in is too much for children. And this is a debate which goes back to the Grimm's fairy tales and beyond, right? And as everyone who works with children know, there are children who can't get enough, love it, want every detail. And then there are children who are terribly upset, not necessarily by the thing that you would predict.
And would you say a word about the relation of Pinocchio to the fairy tale tradition? Talking animals.
Yeah, we have thank you, Larry, because we have a question also from one of the... No, Larry. You asked a question that also a member of our remote audience was asking about the role of animals in Pinocchio, and how Pinocchio is the mediator sometimes of between animals and human beings.
Yes, in fact, Pinocchio understands all animals, and he speaks to animals, and there are many animals in the book. There's a snake that he speaks to. There's a cat and the fox, of course. There's a parrot. There are the rabbits. There is the talking cricket. It's filled with animals, because again, that was the world that people lived in at the time, meaning that there were animals in people's life always, constantly. Collodi even talks about the language of donkeys. And there's also another, he calls it a dialect of, goodness, I'm forgetting. I shouldn't. But of another little animal. I mean, he actually is making Pinocchio understand all animals, except when Pinocchio is a donkey and he tries to talk. People don't understand them, and there is this heartbreaking moment in which he has broken his leg, and he sees he's in theater, he's performing as a donkey, he has broken his leg, and he sees the blue-haired fairy in the audience, and he tries to call out to her to ask for help, and everybody starts laughing, and it's heartbreaking because they don't understand him because he's a donkey. It's terrible. Carlo Collodi had translated the fairy tales of Perrault, and that was his first approach to children's literature. And the way we call Little Red Riding Hood, Cappuccetto Rosso in Italian still today, is Collodi's invention. Those fairy tales had still already been translated by another author, Italian translator, and he had called Little Red Riding Hood with a different name, and that did not stick. It's Cappuccetto Rosso that stuck.
And Cappuccetto is Collodi's translation.
Yes, it's his translation. Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
So Pinocchio has really overshadowed everything that Carlo Collodi did. There's one professor of the University of Florence that claims, Professor Cipriani, that it's thanks to Carlo Collodi's political pieces in the newly born newspaper La Nazione that Tuscany voted for the annexation to the Kingdom of Sardinia, which, of course, has a lot to do with the fact that Italy then became unified. So, yes, Collodi was an amazing human being, actually, in my opinion, yes.
The mystery remains about how his tomb is basically unmarked, and you cannot visit it with ease, right?
I spoke to his last living relative, and I said, "Why is the tomb covered?" And she replied that it's family, it's private. Yeah, and it's understandable. I mean,
is it?
That's what she said.
Does he really belong only to his family? From
Right.
what we said tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think, and also in the meantime, we received answers regarding operas, aside from what our friend here was saying. There were two operas, one in 2007 and one in 2008. And you wonder, how come nothing before, and then within 2 years, you had two operas about Pinocchio. These are Pinocchio's little miracles. I think we had a great evening tonight. So, Anna, thank you so much. Larry, Perri, Ruth. Thanks to all of you for participating so actively, and to our friends who followed in live streaming. I remind you that for the remaining of the week, basically every night except Thursday, we have our festival dedicated to Le Dive del Muto, the great divas of Italian silent cinema. Is the figure of the diva from melodrama, from opera to early cinema. Don't miss it. We have a screening every night. For two of the screening, there is going to be live musical accompaniment, and for one, there is going to be the original score by Mascagni. Don't miss that, and long live Pinocchio and Carlo Collodi. Grazie, Anna.
Grazie.